Welcome to the channel. Today we've got something incredible for you. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a warm autumn afternoon hides a secret. A silver teapot gleams, delicate china waits, and polite smiles conceal restless eyes. One cup holds a deadly secret, and by the time it is sipped, nothing will ever be the same. Can one gentle lady uncover the truth before it's too late? Chapter 1. The afternoon at St. Mary Mead. The village of St. Mary Mead was never in haste. Its rhythms were gentle, church bells marking the hours, sparrows chattering in the hedges, and the low hum of bees drifting over rose gardens. On that particular golden afternoon, however, there was a faint stir of curiosity in the air. For it was known that Mrs. Banbury-Scott, widow of a wealthy industrialist and a lady of formidable presence, was hosting one of her rare afternoon teas. The little ivy-draped cottage she occupied stood at the edge of the green, its windows gleaming in the sunlight. Lace curtains fluttered faintly, and the scent of freshly baked scones seemed to escape onto the lane. Villagers whispered to one another as they passed, speculating who might be invited, for Mrs. Banbury-Scott was both admired and disliked in equal measure. Inside, the drawing-room had been arranged with meticulous care. A round oak table was covered with an embroidered cloth, upon which stood a shining silver teapot, cups of fine bone china with tiny pink roses painted along the rims, and plates stacked with sandwiches and cakes. Everything was polished, gleaming and ordered. Yet, as often is the case in village life, behind the perfection lingered a hidden edge. The guests began to arrive. First came Henry Banbury, her nephew, his shoes too new, his tie too tightly knotted. His smile was eager, but his eyes restless, betraying a nervous ambition. Behind him, Mrs. Price Ridley, tall and thin, entered with her usual air of disapproval, lips pursed as if she tasted vinegar in every polite word. Next, the young Clara Trent, Mrs. Banbury-Scott's secretary, stepped timidly inside, her cheeks pale, her fingers clutching a worn notebook as if for comfort. Lastly, Colonel Pritchard arrived, upright and sturdy, his white moustache bristling with dignity, though his glance wandered often toward the widow with something unresolved in it. And among them, sitting quietly, almost as though part of the furniture itself, was Miss Jane Marple. Her knitting needles clicked softly as she worked on a small pair of baby socks for a neighbour's grandchild. She smiled kindly, listening more than speaking, her pale blue eyes drifting gently from face to face. To any casual observer she seemed a harmless old lady, but behind those gentle eyes lay the sharpest mind in the village. The conversation was light, filled with the ordinary trifles of village life. The roses had done well this year, the grocer was charging scandalous prices for sugar, and the vicar's sermon had run rather long on Sunday. Yet, beneath the hum of talk, there was something faintly taut, like a string drawn too tightly. Mrs. Banbury-Scott, seated at the head of the table, poured the tea with a gracious but commanding hand. Her nephew Henry leaned forward eagerly, speaking of business ventures in London, of opportunities and investments. His aunt listened with half a smile, but her reply was sharp. "I dare say, Henry, that you might profit more by learning thrift than by chasing dreams." The words, though lightly spoken, left the young man's face flushed, and he sipped his tea too quickly to hide his discomfort. Colonel Pritchard, meanwhile, recounted tales of his service abroad, his voice loud and confident, though his gaze lingered too long on his hostess. Mrs. Price Ridley made pointed remarks about the decline of standards in the village, casting her barbs across the table like pins, and Clara, poor girl, remained quiet, stealing glances at her employer, as though fearing to miss a command or reproach. Miss Marple sat, knitting quietly, her ears more attentive than her eyes suggested. She noticed the faint tremble in Clara's hands, the tightening of Henry's jaw, the quick narrowing of Mrs. Price Ridley's eyes when slighted, and the way Colonel Pritchard's fingers tapped impatiently against the china. Small things, but to Miss Marple, it was often in such small things that truth revealed itself. The tea continued, light and cordial on the surface, yet underneath flowed something hidden, a quarrel left unspoken, a resentment unvoiced, a secret yet to be revealed. And as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, painting patterns on the carpet, a strange stillness seemed to settle over the gathering, as if the house itself held its breath. Little did anyone know that within those very walls a crime most terrible was soon to be committed, one born not of passion's heat, but of lies brewed as silently and dangerously as the tea that steamed upon the table. Chapter 2. The village in shock. Morning broke gently over St. Mary Mead, as it always did, with sparrows darting in the hedgerows, the milkman whistling faintly as he set his bottles on the doorsteps, and the first curls of chimney smoke rising from cottages. The village seemed at peace, yet by noon every corner hummed with whispers, for dreadful news had spread. Mrs. Banbury-Scott was dead. The story passed from mouth to mouth, embroidered with each telling. Some swore she had collapsed suddenly of a weak heart. Others whispered of something not quite natural. Shopkeepers leaned closer over their counters. Customers lingered longer than necessary, and even the vicar's wife was seen hurrying from house to house, eager for details. In a small village, death was always a drama, but a death so sudden, in the midst of a cheerful gathering, was nothing less than a shock. Inside the ivy-covered cottage, the atmosphere was thick with unease. The cheerful teacups, the plates with crumbs of scone and cake, all remained as they had been the afternoon before. Yet now the hostess lay still in her chair, her face calm, almost peaceful, as if sleep had taken her in mid-sentence. But the faint scent lingering in the air, sharp, bitter, not quite belonging, told another story to those observant enough to notice. It was Inspector Craddock who arrived from town, his boots leaving prints on the gravel path. He was a polite man, brisk in manner, with the practiced patience of one used to village gossip. His eyes swept the tidy drawing room, noting how undisturbed it seemed. No signs of struggle, no overturned chair, no broken china. Everything was neat, too neat. "Most curious," he murmured, examining the teapot, the cups, the silver tray. His fingers paused at the broken teaspoon, a small thing that seemed to have been overlooked by the servants when they cleared the table. To most, it was nothing more than clumsy breakage. But to Inspector Craddock, it was the first discordant note in what otherwise appeared to be a picture of calm. And there, in the corner of the room, sat Miss Marple, knitting in hand, her face the picture of mild interest. She had come at the inspector's request, not as an official, but as one who always happened to notice the small things. Her pale blue eyes flickered once toward the untouched sugar bowl, then to the faint trace of something, almond perhaps, that lingered near the rim of the teacup Mrs. Banbury-Scott had last held. To anyone else, it might have been dismissed. A trick of the senses, a faint memory of marzipan. But to Miss Marple, who had spent her life among gardens, kitchens and quiet tragedies, that note of almond carried a darker suggestion. Cyanide. The inspector questioned the guests, each of whom had returned in nervous obedience. Henry looked pale, his hands twitching as though he longed for a cigarette. Mrs. Price Ridley's voice was loud, defensive, insisting that she had noticed nothing unusual at all. Clara trembled, her eyes red-rimmed, whispering that her employer had seemed perfectly well. Colonel Pritchard stood stiff, indignant at being summoned like a suspect, his voice booming in protest. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly, saw what others did not. The way Henry avoided looking at his aunt's chair, The sudden quiver in Mrs. Price Ridley's lips when the inspector mentioned poison, the nervous clutch of Clara's hands around her notebook, and the Colonel's too quick anger, like a curtain drawn over something best left hidden. The inspector closed his notebook with a snap. "Until we know more, none of you may leave the village." His words fell heavily in the quiet room. Outside, the villagers gathered in little knots, their voices hushed but eager, the story growing with every telling. One thing was certain: the peaceful rhythm of St. Mary Mead had been broken, replaced by unease. Every face in the village looked sharper that morning, every word carried weight. For in the heart of their quiet community, murder had been served, disguised in a cup of tea, and as Miss Marple walked slowly homeward down the lane, her knitting bag swinging lightly on her arm, she thought to herself with a sigh, "It is always so. People think death comes suddenly, without reason, but there is always a reason, always a hand that guides the cup." Chapter 3. Suspects at the table. The inspector's words still hung in the air when the small company of guests was asked once more to remain in the drawing room. The tea things had been cleared away, yet their presence seemed to linger, like faint ghosts of yesterday's gathering. It was as though every delicate cup and saucer still whispered secrets of what had transpired. Inspector Craddock stood near the mantel, notebook in hand, his brow furrowed. "We must understand clearly who sat where and who did what," he said firmly. His eyes travelled around the circle of faces, each now wearing its own mask of composure, yet betraying to a sharper gaze the little cracks beneath. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, her knitting needles moving with soft rhythmic clicks. To anyone else she seemed an old lady occupied with her yarn, but in truth her mind was weaving threads of another kind, observations, patterns, and small human truths that might form the fabric of a solution. One by one, the guests revealed themselves, not by what they said, but by how they said it. Henry Banbury, the nephew, shifted restlessly. His voice was low, almost sulky, as he explained that he had come only to discuss family matters with his aunt. Yet his eagerness to deny any quarrel betrayed the truth, that there had been one. His hands drummed nervously against his knee, and he seemed far too anxious about what others might think. Miss Marple's eyes softened as she watched him. She had seen that same look in many a young man who hoped for inheritance sooner than fate allowed. Mrs. Price Ridley sat upright, her chin lifted in indignation. Her words were sharp, clipped, as she insisted she had no reason to bear ill will against the deceased. But her eyes flashed when she recalled a recent slight, how Mrs. Banbury-Scott had once called her tiresome in front of the vicar. Pride wounded deeply could, Miss Marple reflected, fester into bitterness, and bitterness was not a harmless thing. Clara Trent, the secretary, spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. She claimed loyalty to her employer, yet her trembling hands betrayed something more. Fear, or perhaps sorrow. Miss Marple noticed how the girl's eyes filled with tears whenever the widow's name was mentioned, and she thought gently, young people often find themselves caught between duty and affection. Sometimes they carry secrets heavier than their years. And then there was Colonel Pritchard, who cleared his throat loudly and declared the whole matter a nonsense. His military bearing, his brisk tones, and his impatience with the proceedings seemed meant to mask an inner disquiet. His gaze had lingered too long on the lifeless chair of the widow, and Miss Marple's wise eyes caught a fleeting expression there, not grief, but something nearer to regret. The inspector made his notes, but Miss Marple saw beyond the ink and paper. Each face told its own story, each gesture painted its own truth. They had all been seated at the table. They had all raised their cups. They had all smiled and spoken polite words. And yet, among them, one hand had reached for death and delivered it silently. The ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece filled the silence that followed the questioning. Its steady rhythm seemed to mark time not as a comfort, but as a reminder that each tick carried them closer to the unveiling of truth. Miss Marple folded her knitting calmly and looked around at the group. To the casual eye, she seemed the picture of harmless gentility. Yet in her mind, she had already begun to sort the puzzle, like the small scraps of wool she kept for mending, fitting together until a whole pattern emerged. And as the inspector closed his notebook, Miss Marple thought quietly to herself, "In village life, people reveal more than they intend. It is never in the grand statements but in the small slips that the truth hides. One must only watch and wait." Outside, the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched long across the cottage garden, and the village of St. Mary Mead, so tranquil to the passing eye, whispered with unease. For it was now certain that among those polite guests at the tea table sat a murderer. Chapter 4. A teacup too many. The drawing room was hushed, save for the occasional shuffle of feet and the faint creak of the old oak floor. The tea things had been tidied into order once more by the maid, yet their gleam and symmetry seemed somehow false, like actors posed upon a stage after the curtain has fallen. The silver tray, the china cups with their tiny painted roses, the milk jug, the sugar bowl, all appeared harmless. And yet, Miss Marple's eyes, calm and deceptively mild, lingered on them with the intensity of one studying a portrait for its hidden brushstrokes. Inspector Craddock, practical man that he was, asked again about the order of the tea. "The lady poured," he said, tapping his pen against his notebook, "and each guest received a cup in turn. Nothing unusual, you all agree?" There was a murmur of assent, some voices brisk, others reluctant. Colonel Pritchard harumphed impatiently. Henry shifted in his chair with visible unease. Clara's eyes darted nervously from face to face. Only Mrs. Price Ridley answered firmly, her tone brittle with irritation. Miss Marple said nothing. Her needles clicked softly in her lap, though her mind was not upon wool. She had been watching as the maid gathered the cups, and a curious detail had caught her attention. She counted them silently, her lips moving ever so slightly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 cups upon the tray. And yet, there had been 5 guests and 1 hostess. 6 cups should have sufficed. Why then had there been 7? Her memory, as sharp as a needle, replayed the scene of yesterday's tea. The silver tray had borne an extra cup, set aside upon the edge, as if waiting for a guest who never came. A small thing, overlooked by all, yet not by Miss Marple. She did not speak of it at once. No, Miss Marple understood the value of silence, of letting threads reveal themselves before they were drawn together. Instead, she remarked gently, "Such a pity about the broken teaspoon. They are so hard to replace nowadays." The remark, so ordinary, drew no notice from the inspector, but Clara looked up sharply, and Henry's fingers twitched at his side. The faint almond scent that had clung to the air still haunted her senses. Cyanide. Miss Marple knew it well enough, for she had once read of a case in her youth where a farmer's wife met an untimely end by its hand. And cyanide, she recalled, was rarely careless. It was deliberate. It clung most often to what was prepared for one person alone. The thought of the 7th cup returned to her again, insistent, like a whisper at the back of the mind. Who had poured it, and for whom was it meant? More importantly, what had become of it after? Cups did not vanish into thin air. Miss Marple lifted her gaze, serene and untroubled to the casual eye. Yet beneath that gentle look, her mind moved as quietly and steadily as a river in the dark. She studied Henry's nervous tapping, Mrs. Price Ridley's offended sniff, Clara's trembling hands, and the Colonel's gruff impatience. Each face bore its own story, Each carried its own guilt of something. The inspector pressed on with questions, but it was Miss Marple who had already glimpsed the faint outline of a pattern. One cup too many, one cup missing now, a shadow of deceit among the silver and porcelain. As the evening light faded, spilling golden rays through the lace curtains, Miss Marple thought gently, almost to herself. It is always in the smallest things. A stitch too loose, a crumb on the tablecloth, a cup without a drinker. The world believes murder to be grand and dramatic, but it is often no more than this, a single teacup, misplaced. And in that quiet moment, while the inspector frowned over his notes, Miss Marple knew the truth had already begun to show itself, hidden, as it so often was, in plain sight. Chapter 5. The web of motives. The quiet of St. Mary Mead was deceptive. To a passing traveller it might seem nothing more than a peaceful English village, roses blooming in tidy gardens, lace curtains fluttering in the breeze, the church bell chiming softly at the hour. Yet beneath the surface, whispers spread like ripples across a pond. By now everyone knew Mrs. Banbury-Scott had not died a natural death. Poison, so dreadful a word in such a tranquil setting, had entered their afternoon tea. In the drawing-room of the ivy-clad cottage, Inspector Craddock sat with his notebook, piecing together facts with the blunt logic of a policeman. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her chair with her knitting upon her lap, thought not of facts alone. She thought of people, of small habits, wounded pride, desperate needs, and the quiet cruelties that sprouted in the soil of village life. For it was never the grand, dramatic motives alone that led to murder. More often, it was the petty and the ordinary, jealousy, debt, pride, that festered until it grew poisonous. One by one, the threads of motive revealed themselves. Henry Banbury, the nephew, stood pale and restless near the window. It was whispered that his business affairs were troubled, that creditors pressed upon him. His aunt, wealthy and cautious, had refused to lend him more than a pittance. To a young man with ambition but little means, the promise of an inheritance must have glittered like salvation. His eagerness, his nervous movements, these were not merely grief. They were the marks of a man cornered by life. Mrs. Price Ridley, prim and severe, had her own reasons for bitterness. Only a week before, Mrs. Banbury-Scott had humiliated her at the church bazaar, calling her an interfering busybody within earshot of half the village. To the proud and easily slighted, such words could wound deeply. Resentment could curdle into malice, and malice, Miss Marple knew, often disguised itself as respectability. Clara Trent, the secretary, wept softly into her handkerchief, her loyalty to her employer proclaimed with every trembling word. Yet Miss Marple had observed how the girl had received letters in secret, and how she had flushed when questioned about them. A young woman in service often found herself entangled in affairs not wholly her own, affairs that might lead to concealment, and concealment often paved the way for suspicion. And then there was Colonel Pritchard, who spoke loudly of his honour and indignation. Yet long ago it was known, he had courted Mrs. Banbury-Scott and been refused. Pride, bruised in youth, had a way of lingering, turning over the years into a quiet, simmering resentment. The Colonel's temper, though easily roused, concealed something more subtle, the wound of rejection that never quite healed. Miss Marple knitted calmly, the faint click of her needles filling the silence. To the inspector, motives were like evidence, something to be weighed, measured and written down. To Miss Marple they were the threads of a tapestry, weaving themselves into a pattern as familiar as one of her own knitted shawls. Each person bore a reason. Each person carried a shadow. But she reminded herself gently, it is not always the grandest grievance that leads to murder. Often it is the smallest, most ordinary quarrel that gives rise to the darkest deed. Her eyes wandered once more to the tea tray, her mind circling back to the missing cup. It was the quiet detail that would not let her rest. One cup too many, one cup now gone. Who had lifted it? Who had placed it? That small, silent act was the thread that tied all their motives together. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped behind the cottages, casting long shadows across the village green. Children's laughter drifted faintly, mingling with the murmur of gossip from neighbours. Yet within Miss Marple's mind, a different music played, a quiet pattern of lies and truths, knitting itself toward revelation. She folded her knitting with delicate care, her face serene, her voice gentle as she spoke, almost to herself. Human nature does not change. We tell lies as easily as we take sugar in our tea, but lies like sugar dissolve, and sooner or later the truth remains. Chapter 6. The poison revealed. The following morning dawned clear and bright, yet in St. Mary Mead, the sunlight seemed muted by the shadow of tragedy. At the ivy-covered cottage, the inspector and the village doctor stood solemnly in the drawing-room, the faint rustle of papers and the scent of disinfectant replacing the fragrance of yesterday's roses and scones. Dr. Craddock, a practical man with kind eyes, closed his medical report and spoke in a voice that carried both weight and certainty. "There can be no doubt," he said gravely. "Mrs. Banbury-Scott died from cyanide poisoning." The word cyanide seemed to thicken the air, as though the walls themselves recoiled from it. The guests, summoned once more, sat pale and tense. A murmur passed among them, fearful and incredulous. Cyanide, that bitter almond-scented killer, swift and merciless, had found its way into a teacup in this very room. Inspector Craddock frowned deeply. "The difficulty," he admitted, "is that there is no trace of poison in the pot itself, nor in the milk, nor in the sugar bowl. It was not shared among you. It must have been placed in one cup only." The words settled like stones. One cup, prepared for one person. One deliberate act. No accident, no mistake. Someone at that very table had set death before the hostess, as neatly as a slice of sponge cake. Miss Marple, seated quietly by the window, let her needles rest in her lap. She had known it, of course. The faint trace of almond upon the air had confirmed her suspicions long before the doctor's report. But she listened, patient as always, allowing the inspector to reach his own conclusions. She watched the faces instead, the nervous twitch of Henry's mouth, the tight line of Mrs. Price Ridley's lips, the way Clara's hands fumbled with her handkerchief, and the Colonel's stiff, too loud exclamations of innocence. It was Henry who spoke first, his voice strained. "But surely it could have been accidental." "Something she ate." The doctor shook his head firmly. "No, my boy. This was no accident. It was deliberate." A dose far too strong to mistake Mrs. Price Ridley drew herself up, indignant. "Really? To suggest such a thing among friends? I shall not sit by and be insulted." Yet her protest rang hollow, for she would not meet the inspector's gaze. Clara whispered faintly. "But she was so well. She seemed so strong yesterday." Her eyes filled with tears, and she pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Colonel Pritchard cleared his throat loudly, his voice gruff. "Nonsense, all this. The woman had a weak constitution. I never trusted doctors' reports much." Yet his face was pale, and the tremor in his hand betrayed him. Miss Marple observed it all, her expression serene, almost sympathetic. She thought of the missing 7th cup, that quiet detail the others had forgotten. If poison was in only one cup, then someone had prepared it with care, ensuring it reached the hands of Mrs. Banbury-Scott. But why had the extra cup been set upon the tray? For whom was it meant? The inspector scribbled in his notebook, muttering about opportunity and timing. But Miss Marple's mind worked differently. She thought of human habits, of the way people reveal themselves in small things. She remembered Henry's eagerness, Mrs. Price Ridley's pride, Clara's secrecy, and the Colonel's wounded dignity. Each had reason, each had opportunity, yet only one had acted. She took up her knitting once more, the soft click of the needles filling the silence. To the inspector, it was the sound of an old lady passing the time. To Miss Marple, it was rhythm for thought, a quiet accompaniment to her inner reasoning. Her gaze drifted to the empty chair where Mrs. Banbury-Scott had sat only yesterday, alive and commanding, pouring tea with an air of superiority. Now that chair was nothing but an absence, a reminder of how swiftly life could be overturned by a single hidden act. In her heart, Miss Marple sighed. People imagine murder to be violent, dramatic, but it is so often quiet, served in a teacup, hidden behind a smile. The inspector's voice broke the silence. "One of you is lying," he said firmly, scanning the room. "And I intend to find out who." The words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time every guest shifted uneasily in their seat. The murder was no longer an abstract horror. It was a presence among them. And Miss Marple, with her calm, bird-like gaze, knew the path of truth was narrowing. Somewhere, in the detail of that missing cup, in the tremor of a hand, in the slip of a tongue, the murderer had already revealed themselves. She had only to wait, to watch, and to listen. Chapter 7. The Slip of the Tongue. The day after the doctor's grim confirmation, St. Mary Mead seemed quieter than usual, as though the village itself held its breath. Curtains twitched as neighbours watched each other with new suspicion, and polite greetings in the lanes carried an edge of unease. The truth was spreading, like ink through blotting paper. Mrs. Banbury-Scott had not died naturally. She had been poisoned, at her very own tea table. Miss Marple, however, went about her usual ways with her serene manner. She stopped to admire Mrs. Hartnell's dahlias, asked after the vicar's lumbago, and returned home to her cottage with her knitting basket. Yet her mind was not on flowers or ailments. It was fixed on the puzzle: 6 guests, 6 cups, and the mysterious 7th cup that had vanished like smoke. That afternoon, as Miss Marple sat in her small garden, knitting a soft woolen scarf in the gentle autumn sunlight, she was visited unexpectedly by Clara Trent. The young secretary looked pale, her eyes rimmed with red, as though sleep had eluded her. She clutched her handbag nervously, twisting it in her fingers. "I had to come, Miss Marple," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't bear it any longer. They'll suspect me. I know they will. And I don't know what to do." Miss Marple looked up kindly, her needles pausing. "My dear," she said softly, "it is best to speak plainly. What is troubling you?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I saw something at the tea. I didn't want to say, because it seemed silly and I thought perhaps I imagined it. But now, with the talk of poison—" She swallowed hard, her voice breaking. "I saw Mrs. Price Ridley. She switched her cup with Aunt Banbury-Scott's just before the toast." Miss Marple's hands remained steady, though her eyes sharpened. "Switched the cups, you say? And why would she do such a thing?" Clara shook her head. They had quarrelled, just quietly, about the charity committee. Mrs. Price Ridley seemed offended. She moved her cup, almost in a fit of temper, so Aunt's cup was before her instead. But then Aunt laughed and moved hers back. The image was clear enough. 2 cups, exchanged in a petty moment, then restored. A small gesture of pride, a ripple of defiance. But in that simple movement, a thread of truth shone out. The poisoned cup had not been meant for Mrs. Price Ridley at all. It had been meant for someone else. Clara pressed her handkerchief to her lips. "I didn't want to say. I thought it might get me into trouble. But I can't keep it back now. It feels as though I've been carrying a stone in my chest. Miss Marple reached out, patting her hand with gentle firmness. You have done the right thing, my dear. It is often in the little quarrels that truth reveals itself. But Clara, still trembling, let slip another confession, one she had not intended. And then, just before tea, I saw Henry leave the room for a moment. He said he was fetching more napkins, but I thought it odd, for the maid had already laid them out. He was gone only a minute, but... She faltered, realizing too late what she had said. Her eyes widened and she shook her head. Oh, I shouldn't have spoken of it. But Miss Marple only smiled faintly, her eyes serene. On the contrary, my dear, you have spoken very wisely indeed, for to Miss Marple that careless slip was no accident. A missing cup, a quarrel over nothing, and Henry's needless errand, threads that once seemed scattered were beginning to weave together. The poisoned cup, it seemed, had not been meant for Mrs. Banbury-Scott after all. Fate, or perhaps pride, had altered the design at the last moment. As Clara departed, Miss Marple sat alone with her knitting, the soft clicking of needles mingling with the song of the blackbirds in the hedge. Her thoughts were calm, but resolute. It is the smallest words, the smallest slips, that unravel the grandest lies, she reflected. And somewhere in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, the murderer, who had believed their secret safe, had already betrayed themselves with nothing more than a careless tongue. Chapter 8. The Reconstruction. The autumn afternoon settled gently over St. Mary Mead, with a pale sun filtering through lace curtains and long shadows stretching across the green. Yet inside Mrs. Banbury-Scott's drawing room, a strange sort of drama was about to unfold. For at Miss Marple's quiet suggestion, Inspector Craddock had agreed to a most unusual request, a careful reconstruction of the tea party. The room had been tidied, the table reset exactly as it had been on that fateful day. The silver tray gleamed once more with china cups painted with delicate roses. The teapot steamed faintly, and the little plates of scones and sandwiches sat neatly arranged. To an unsuspecting eye, it might have seemed a simple gathering for afternoon refreshment, but for those summoned, the sight of it carried a chill. The suspects took their places reluctantly. Henry Banbury stood stiff by the window, his face pale and restless. Mrs. Price Ridley pursed her lips in visible disapproval, muttering that such theatrics were quite unnecessary. Clara, fragile and pale, obeyed nervously, her hands shaking as she placed herself in the same seat as before. Colonel Pritchard harumphed loudly, though he sat obediently where instructed, his moustache twitching with suppressed irritation. Miss Marple herself sat in her accustomed place, quiet, unassuming, her knitting bag by her side. To anyone watching, she looked like a gentle old lady presiding over a harmless village tea, but her blue eyes missed nothing, moving gently from cup to cup, from hand to hand, from expression to expression. Now, said Inspector Craddock briskly, we shall proceed just as you did before. Each of you, take your places, recall how you were seated, how the cups were arranged, every detail if you please. The group shifted uneasily. One by one they described their movements. Who had poured the milk? Who had taken sugar? Who had declined it? The inspector scribbled notes, but Miss Marple merely folded her hands, her gaze thoughtful. At last she spoke, her voice soft, almost grandmotherly. It is curious, is it not, how something as ordinary as a tea tray may carry the weight of life and death, and yet the truth lies here before us. Her eyes rested on the tray. There were 6 of us seated that day, yet 7 cups were set out. 1 cup placed quietly on the edge of the tray, as though waiting. A cup which vanished afterward. She paused, letting the words sink into the silence. And I think we all know it was no accident." Henry shifted, his throat dry, but said nothing. Mrs. Price Ridley scoffed softly, though her fingers tightened on her lap. Clara lowered her eyes, her face pale. The Colonel's jaw clenched. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her manner gentle but firm. "It is impossible the poison was in the pot. The doctor proved it, and yet cyanide was found in one cup alone. That cup had been prepared beforehand, placed deliberately for Mrs. Banbury-Scott. The switching of cups with Mrs. Price Ridley only delayed the design until fate restored it." Her words, calm and clear, seemed to fall with the inevitability of the ticking clock upon the mantelpiece. The room grew colder, though the fire burned bright. Clara gave a faint sob. Henry's hand twitched at his side. Colonel Pritchard's face darkened with suppressed anger, and Mrs. Price Ridley sat rigid, her lips a thin, trembling line. Miss Marple continued softly. "It is a simple puzzle once one notices the pattern. One does not prepare an entire teapot when one wishes to kill a single person. One prepares a single cup and places it exactly where that person will sit, and our dear hostess always sat at the head of her table. Always." The inspector looked sharply at Henry, whose face was now damp with sweat. But Miss Marple merely resumed her knitting, her needles clicking gently in the silence. To the untrained eye, it seems chance, confusion. "But in truth," she said, her voice almost soothing, "it is no more mysterious than the pattern in a piece of lace. Once you see how the stitches fall, you see the whole design." The guests sat frozen, each caught in their own fear, their own guilt, their own hidden secrets. The trap had been set, not with force or accusation, but with quiet observation and the simple recreation of a tea tray. And as the clock ticked steadily on, the web of lies began to tighten, the truth drawing ever nearer, like a shadow creeping across the floor at dusk. Chapter 9. The gentle accusation. The air in the drawing-room had grown heavy. Though the fire crackled softly on the hearth, a chill seemed to linger in the corners, as though the very walls were listening. The suspects sat in silence, their eyes fixed on the delicate china cups upon the tray, each cup now transformed in their minds from a harmless vessel of tea into a silent instrument of death. Miss Marple, calm and composed, set her knitting down upon her lap. She looked around at the company with her gentle bird-like gaze. To the casual eye she appeared nothing more than a kindly spinster addressing her neighbours, yet every word that left her lips carried the quiet weight of truth. "My dear friends," she began softly, "murder is a most dreadful business, and yet in its essence it is no more complicated than the daily quarrels and small deceits of ordinary life. People imagine it to be dramatic, dark shadows and violent passions. But here, as in so many cases, it was no more than greed and desperation, hidden in the ordinary ritual of afternoon tea." Henry shifted in his chair, his face pale. Clara's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed indignantly, though her hands trembled slightly. Colonel Pritchard glared at the carpet, his moustache bristling as though defying an unseen enemy. Miss Marple continued, her tone soothing, almost regretful. "The poison was not in the pot, nor in the sugar bowl, nor in the milk. It was in one cup, prepared before the tea began. That cup was placed at the head of the table, where Mrs. Banbury-Scott always sat. It was meant for her, and for her alone." The inspector leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Go on, Miss Marple." She inclined her head slightly. "There was, as I observed, a 7th cup. Too many for the guests present. It had been set aside, waiting. And who, I ask, had the chance to slip away before the tea, under the pretense of fetching napkins that were already laid?" Her eyes, kind yet unyielding, rested upon Henry. "It was you, Henry Banbury. You placed the poison in the cup while alone in the kitchen. You arranged it so that your aunt would drink and drink quickly while the others were none the wiser. You believed her death would appear sudden, natural, and in your desperation, you thought only of your inheritance." A hush fell. Henry's lips parted, his breath quick and shallow. His hands clenched at his sides, then loosened again, as if he were weighing the futility of denial. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost sorrowful. "But fate, Henry, has a way of turning against us." For when Mrs. Price Ridley, in a moment of temper, exchanged her cup with your aunt's, it nearly undid your plan. Yet your aunt, confident in her own place at the table, took her cup back. And so, though your scheme was perfect in design, it betrayed itself by that very act. A poisoned cup cannot vanish. Its presence lingers no matter how carefully.
"It is hidden," Mrs. Price Ridley gasped audibly, her hand flying to her chest. Clara sobbed quietly into her handkerchief. Colonel Pritchard muttered something inaudible, his face grim. Henry rose suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You can't prove it," he cried hoarsely. "You've no evidence, only the ramblings of an old woman." But his words rang hollow, for his face was ashen, his voice cracked with fear. The inspector stood at once, firm and commanding, but Miss Marple raised a hand gently. "There is no need for anger, Henry," she said softly. "The truth always shows itself in the end. You see, it is not I who accuse you, it is your own actions. The missing cup, the needless errand, the trembling in your hands. All small things, perhaps, but it is always in the small things that human nature betrays itself." Henry sank back into his chair, defeated, his head bowed. The room seemed to exhale, as though the tension that had hung so thickly was finally released. Miss Marple took up her knitting once more, her expression serene. "It grieves me, Henry," she said quietly. "You were not cruel by nature, only desperate. But desperation, alas, can be as deadly as hatred." The inspector placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. "You'd best come along now." And so, in the fading light of that autumn day, the murderer was revealed, not by force, nor by violence, but by the quiet, unwavering wisdom of an elderly lady with sharp eyes and a gentle voice, who saw in human folly the truth others missed. Chapter 10. Tea, Lies, and Justice. Evening descended upon St. Mary Mead with a hush of finality, as though the village itself sought to close the matter with quiet dignity. The church bell tolled softly in the distance, children were called indoors by their mothers, and the lamps along the lanes flickered to life one by one. The events of the past days, whispers of poison, suspicion and guilt, still lingered in every corner, yet a sense of resolution now rested upon the air. In the ivy-covered cottage the inspector had taken Henry away. The room stood oddly empty without his restless presence, though the echo of his outburst still seemed to hang in the walls. Mrs. Price Ridley departed in flustered indignation, declaring that she had always suspected there was something shifty about Henry. Colonel Pritchard marched off with stiff dignity, muttering about youth gone astray. And poor Clara, relieved yet shaken, went home quietly, her eyes red but her spirit lighter now that the burden of silence had been lifted. Left alone at last, Miss Marple lingered for a while in the quiet drawing-room. The fire glowed low, the tray of cups and saucers gleamed faintly in the dim light. To the casual eye, it was once more just an ordinary tea table. Yet to Miss Marple, it would forever hold the memory of a desperate crime, a single poisoned cup hidden among the rituals of civility. She bent down to retrieve her knitting bag, her needles glinting faintly. A scarf in pale blue wool hung from them, soft and unfinished, waiting for her patient hands. She smiled gently as she tucked it away. For Miss Marple, Knitting was more than pastime. It was thought made visible, a pattern woven from the smallest stitches, just as life itself was made from the smallest choices. Walking slowly home along the quiet lane, she reflected upon the case with her usual calm. People, she mused, often imagined murder to be monstrous, born of wild passions or unearthly cruelty. But in truth, it was nearly always quite ordinary, an inheritance longed for, a quarrel unhealed, a moment of desperate weakness. Henry, poor foolish boy, had not been evil in heart. He had been desperate. A man drowning in debt, unable to see beyond the shadow of his troubles, had reached for the cruelest of solutions. And yet, as Miss Marple knew so well, evil did not always roar like a beast. It often whispered, soft as steam rising from a teacup. She paused at her own garden gate, the roses pale in the moonlight, the scent of lavender drifting in the air. A blackbird stirred in the hedge, then settled again. All seemed peaceful once more. Yet Miss Marple, wise in the ways of human nature, knew that peace was only ever a surface. Beneath it, hearts beat with secrets, with loves and envies, with kindness and cruelty alike. Settling into her chair by her own fire, Miss Marple took up her knitting once again. Her needles clicked softly in the quiet, steady and soothing. She thought, with a faint sigh, "It is curious, is it not, that such dreadful things may be hidden among lace curtains and tea trays. Yet the truth, like steam, cannot be contained. It rises always, until at last it is seen." Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead slept under the calm watch of the autumn moon. The crime was ended, justice set in motion. And once again, the quiet wisdom of a gentle old lady had revealed the darkest secret of all, that within the smallest, simplest things, a quarrel, a glance, a cup of tea, lay the power of life and death.